The wind on the Mongolian steppe did not whisper. It screamed. It tore across the plains like a living thing, carrying the scent of smoke, sweat, and blood, howling through the torn banners that marked the end of another rebellion. In the gray dawn light, the horizon looked endless, yet nowhere escape. Beneath the cold breath of that vast emptiness, a group of prisoners knelt in silence, their hands bound behind their backs with rawhide cords so tight that skin had turned purple and split open in thin, wet lines. The soldiers around them moved with the precision of men performing a ritual rather than a task. They were not angry. They were efficient. Their eyes, black and still, mirrored the unfailing discipline that had made them instruments of a man who believed the world was his to sculpt or destroy. A horn sounded deep and metallic, echoing across the plain. Every head turned toward the ridge where a single rider stood outlined against the morning sky. The figure did not need introduction. Even at a distance, his presence felt heavier than the air itself. The prisoners began to shake, not because they recognized the face of Genghis Khan, but because they felt the gravity of what he represented. A will so absolute, it had erased entire nations. A silence so vast, it drowned out the screams of millions. He did not need to raise his voice. A mere gesture of his hand was enough. The soldiers began their work. The first man was tied between two horses, his body stretched taut like a boring. The animals were restless, stamping the frozen ground, their nostrils steaming in the dawn chill. The command was whispered almost gently, and then the world broke. A single wet sound, followed by a roar of wind and panic, filled the air. The others watched, paralyzed, as the body split apart in the middle, limbs flung in opposite directions. It wasn't just death, it was demonstration. It was how the Khan taught obedience through fear so pure it felt divine. But what made Genghis Khan's cruelty so unforgettable wasn't merely the brutality of the act. It was the purpose behind it. Every punishment was a message, every scream a sentence written in flesh. He understood that terror could travel faster than armies, that the imagination of pain could conquer more effectively than steel. To defy him was not just to risk death, was to invite a spectacle meant to erase you from memory itself. Before we descend deeper into the shadows of this empire of obedience and blood, take a moment to subscribe and join this exploration into humanity's darkest corners. Because what lies ahead is not just the story of one man's savagery, but of how the world itself once bowed to fear. The methods you're about to hear were not acts of madness. They were instruments of empire, forged in cruelty, perfected in silence. And among them were tortures so creative, so coldly methodical, that even centuries later, they seem to have crossed every limit ever drawn between civilization and hell. Long before the world trembled at his name, he was simply Toijin, a boy born into hunger and betrayal beneath the open sky of the Central Asian steppe. His early years were not the stuff of legend, but of survival. So brutal, it carved the idea of mercy out of him forever. When his father was poisoned by rivals, Toijin's family was abandoned by their tribe, left to starve among wolves and wind. He scavenged the frozen earth for roots, hunted rats with stones, and learned that compassion had no currency in a world that only respected strength. The steppe became his first teacher. Its storms taught him endurance. Its silence taught him patience, and its cruelty taught him justice. By the time he gathered followers, he had already transformed pain into law and despair into discipline. He did not merely want revenge. He wanted order, the kind that could be born only through absolute obedience. To the west, the Mongols were savages, nomads wrapped in fur and dust. But within their world, Genghis Khan's rise was an act of divine symmetry. He united clans that had slaughtered each other for centuries, binding them not through kindness, but through fear and reward, weaving them into a war machine that moved like a single breathing organism. The Yasa, his secret code of laws, was his true weapon. It was less a moral guide and more an architecture of terror, a system that defined loyalty by obedience and defined betrayal by annihilation. The Yasa decreed that lying, theft, disobedience, or betrayal to the Khan was not a crime of man, but of cosmos. To defy the Khan was to disturb the balance of the world itself, and the punishment had to restore harmony through pain. Under that law, torture was not random cruelty. It was justice sanctified, brutality elevated to ceremony. As the empire grew, stretching from the Pacific to the Black Sea, the machinery of punishment grew with it. Cities that resisted were erased, not just militarily, but symbolically. In Nishapur, when a Mongol general's son was killed, the city's entire population, men, women, and children, was executed. Their skulls stacked into pyramids as monuments of obedience. Chroniclers like Juvani and Rashid Allen, writing under trembling hands, spoke of Mongol soldiers who could laugh while slaughtering entire streets, because they believed they were cleansing impurity from the world. The philosophy was terrifyingly simple. Mercy created weakness, and weakness invited chaos. To rule such a vast, unruly empire, Genghis needed not only conquest, but the illusion of divine authority. Torture became the instrument through which that illusion was sustained. Its echoes rippling across nations, turning entire civilizations into obedient silence. Yet what set Genghis Khan apart was not the quantity of blood spilled, but the precision with which it was orchestrated. His wars were campaigns of mathematics. Each city reduced by strategy, each punishment performed with symbolic intent. The breaking of bodies mirrored the breaking of wills. The destruction of homes mirrored the destruction of histories. When he executed a noble, he did not simply kill a man. He dismantled the myth of his lineage. The execution was often public, theatrical, designed to remind the survivors that resistance was not an act of courage, but of futility. Prisoners were made to witness, to feel the vibration of horror so deeply that it became hereditary. Passed down through bloodlines as inherited fear, he knew the value of terror as currency. Spend it lavishly enough, and wars would end before they began. To the Mongols themselves, this cruelty was not barbarism, but order. In their belief, the great Khan was chosen by the eternal blue sky, the divine force that governed the world. His decrees were not political choices. They were cosmic commands. If a man defied the Khan, he defied heaven. And heaven, they believed, could not be challenged without consequence. Thus, executions, impalements, drownings, and burnings were not punishments alone. They were offerings to a universe that demanded symmetry between offense and pain. Mongol chroniclers described scenes where the condemned were forced to kneel before the Khan's throne, the air thick with incense and iron. The executioner's hands steady as he carried out the sentence while priests chanted prayers to the eternal sky. Every act of cruelty was sanctified by ritual, as if to remind the witnesses that this was not chaos. It was divine justice, purified through suffering. Even his generals, men hardened by decades of slaughter, learned to fear his discipline. Betrayal was not forgiven, no matter how high one's rank or how close one stood to him. When Genghis discovered that one of his commanders had hidden spoils from a campaign, he ordered the man's death not through sword, but through suffocation, wrapping him in a carpet so that noble blood would touch the earth. This detail reveals the meticulous duality of Mongol justice. They respected the earth too much to stain it, yet saw no contradiction in crushing a human life within it. Every rule of their world existed within this paradox. A civilization of the sword that believed it was protecting cosmic order, even as it unmade the world beneath its hooves. The Mongol conquest was not simply a military event. It was a redefinition of how fear could govern humanity. Wherever their horses rode, the old ways of punishment were absorbed and adapted, merged into the Mongol system until cruelty itself became an empire-wide language. In China, they adopted methods of slow execution and combined them with their own innovations. In Persia, they refined public torture into spectacle. In the steppes, they turned execution into ritual. The result was a seamless web of psychological warfare so complete that it transcended borders and generations. When cities heard the rumor that the Khan's army was approaching, they would surrender without a fight. Not because they feared death, but because they feared the manner of it. What makes Genghis Khan's legacy endure through centuries is not only his victories, but the psychological scar he left on civilization. His empire taught the world that domination was not sustained by swords alone, but by memory. By embedding terror so deeply into the human mind that even peace would taste of submission. The Mongol yoke was not carried only on backs. It lived inside the conscience of nations long after his death. Every empire that followed, from the Ottomans to the Tsars, borrowed something from that lesson, that power is not secure until it becomes fear-made law. And so, as the Mongol banners spread across the known world, every conquest carried with it not just the weight of military genius, but the shadow of punishment perfected. The Yasa had done its work. The laws of the steppes had become the laws of the earth. Yet behind that order, beneath the empire's shimmering veil of glory, lay chambers and courtyards, where screams were swallowed by the cold wind places, where the human body became a language of obedience, and pain was the grammar of empire. It is in those forgotten corners of history that the true darkness of Genghis Khan's rule emerges, not in the battles he won, but in the punishments he devised to ensure that no one would ever dare to lose against him again. There comes a moment in the chronicle of every empire when victory ceases to be about conquest and becomes instead about performance. When cruelty transforms from necessity into theater. In the age of Genghis Khan, this transformation was complete. His punishments were not the chaos of a tyrant drunk on blood, but the choreography of a ruler who understood that fear was the purest language of power. Each execution, each act of mutilation or humiliation served as a message, one written not with ink, but with flesh. The Mongol world was built upon the logic that the body could be made to speak truth through agony. That terror could create loyalty faster than gold could buy it, and that the spectacle of suffering could shape entire civilizations. And as the Khan's empire spread, so too did the evolution of pain. Each layer more deliberate, more symbolic, more calculated to destroy the very idea of resistance. Among the earliest and most widespread punishments of Genghis Khan's reign was strangulation by boring or rawhide rope. A method deceptively simple, yet soaked in meaning. To the Mongols, spilling the blood of a noble was sacrilege. Thus, the rope became both weapon and sacrament. Victims were forced to kneel before the Khan's guards, often in front of their families, their throats wrapped in taut cords that bit into the skin until purple veins burst beneath the surface. No blade was used, only pressure, slow and relentless, applied until the body went limp, and the air escaped in a sound that was half gasp, half prayer. The soldiers who carried out these deaths did so without emotion, as if tightening the rope was a kind of offering to the eternal sky. Yet the cruelty of the act was not in the death itself, but in the ritual surrounding it. The condemned were made to confess, to speak aloud their crimes, while their enemies watched in reverent silence. Their final words became the script of obedience for those who lived. Worse still were the executions carried out by wheel or wagon, what later chroniclers called the turning. Rebels and deserters were tied beneath the wheels of carts and slowly rolled across the ground until bones cracked and skin shredded like paper. The wheel was not merely an instrument of pain. It was a symbol of the endless cycle of law. The Mongols believed that every betrayal disrupted the cosmic balance. By breaking the traitor's body beneath a wheel, they restored order through destruction. In one recorded instance, a captured Korsmian commander was lashed between two carts. His limbs stretched in opposite directions while musicians played drums to drown out his screams. To the crowd, this was not horror, 'twas instruction. The Khan did not need to shout commands. He simply let agony speak on his behalf. The wheel turned, and with it, the will of the empire. There were punishments so severe that even the chroniclers, hardened by decades of carnage, wrote of them with trembling hands. Chief among them was the execution by boiling, a fate reserved for betrayers, spies, and envoys who defied the Khan's authority. Captives were bound hand and foot, stripped naked, and lowered into great iron cauldrons filled not with water, but with oil or molten metal heated by roaring fires. Witnesses described the sound as something unearthly. The shrill pitch of flesh separating from bone, the sizzle of fat. The reek of burning hair mixing with incense meant to purify the air. To the Mongols, fire was sacred, a manifestation of the sky's divine judgment. Thus, to die by fire was both punishment and purification, a way to cleanse the sin of disobedience while leaving behind no body that could be buried or mourned. The method's symbolism was not accidental. Genghis Khan understood that to burn a man alive before his peers was to turn him into myth. The heat and smoke carried his suffering upward, spreading the story of his demise faster than any messenger could ride. Villages would hear of such acts and surrender without a fight, terrified not by the soldiers, but by the thought of being made examples of. The fire pit, then, was not a place of random cruelty. It was an altar upon which the empire renewed its covenant with fear. In some cases, prisoners were forced to stoke the flames that would later consume them, turning obedience itself into a tool of damnation. When the smoke rose into the pale sky, the soldiers would kneel and bow their heads, not to the dead, but to the lesson. If the rope and the fire symbolized the restraint and purification of the disobedient, then the horses symbolized the violent balance of the universe. Among the Mongols, execution by horses was the most infamous and feared form of death, a punishment that turned the strength of their most sacred animal into the instrument of annihilation. The condemned was tied by wrists and ankles to 4 horses standing at the corners of a square, each beast held in check by soldiers waiting for the signal. When the Khan's hand rose, silence fell. When it dropped, chaos began. The horses lunged in opposite directions, muscles rippling beneath their armor, hooves tearing at the frozen earth. The body between them stretched, resisted, and finally gave way with a sound that silenced even the bravest. Flesh ripped from flesh, bones snapped like reeds in a storm. What remained was no longer a man, but a memory erased from mortar, a warning carved into the minds of those who watched. To the Mongols, this act was not barbarism, but ceremony. The tearing apart of the body mirrored the punishment of the soul, which they believed would wander forever, divided, unable to find rest or rebirth. This fate was considered worse than death itself, a spiritual exile more terrifying than execution. Among all the punishments that stained the pages of the Mongol chronicles, there was one that seemed less like justice and more like an unholy ritual. A method so precise, so drenched in symbolism, that it transcended cruelty and entered the realm of myth. It was spoken of only in fragments, carried through whispers in Persian courts, and murmured in fear by survivors along the Silk Road. They called it the Silver Death. The legend told that for those who betrayed the Khan or defied him in greed, their fate was sealed not with a sword, but with molten silver. The victim would be restrained, royal, noble, or merchant. His wealth confiscated, his treasures piled before him as a mockery of his desire. Then, as the crowd watched in horrified silence, the executioners would melt his own silver into a liquid gleam that shimmered like a mirror of the moon. It would be poured slowly, carefully into his eyes and ears, burning through his flesh in an agony so complete that no scream could emerge. Death came not as mercy, but as revelation. The man consumed by the very metal he worshipped. Chroniclers wrote that this punishment was inflicted upon the brother of the Khorzam Shah, a ruler whose arrogance had challenged the Khan's empire. Whether myth or memory, the act revealed a truth darker than any legend that Genghis Khan had perfected the art of transforming vengeance into parable. Yet the Silver Death was only one manifestation of a greater system, a machinery of power that turned horror into governance. The Khan did not kill out of impulse. He killed to establish rhythm. His empire was a symphony conducted in screams and silences, each atrocity carefully calibrated to echo through generations. The Mongols understood that memory itself could be weaponized, that the recollection of agony could discipline entire nations. Villages that surrendered without resistance were left untouched, their loyalty rewarded with trade and security. But those who faltered, who lied, resisted, or conspired, were not merely punished, they were erased. Their cities became fields of skulls, their rivers turned red in ritual purification, their names banned from history. The punishment extended beyond the flesh. It was aimed at the idea of disobedience itself, buried beneath ruins so complete that even archaeologists centuries later would struggle to find traces of life. This was cruelty elevated to bureaucracy, atrocity turned into infrastructure. One Persian historian recorded that after the fall of MV, a city that had once rivaled Baghdad in beauty, the Mongols executed nearly 700,000 people in a single week. But the horror did not lie in the number. It lay in the precision. The executions were organized by professioned scholars, soldiers, merchants, craftsmen. Each category systematically annihilated, as if the act itself were a census of death. The Mongol scribes recorded every detail, not in shame, but in order. To them, slaughter was not chaos, it was administration. Every decapitated body was an entry in a ledger of conquest. The empire did not hide its crimes. It documented them. And in that cold precision, the world glimpsed the birth of something monstrous. The idea that cruelty could be made efficient, that horror could be quantified, that terror could be as orderly as trade. Perhaps the most terrifying element of Genghis Khan's cruelty was not the bloodshed itself, but the absence of contradiction within it. To his followers, there was no moral divide between creation and destruction. Roads were built over mass graves. Trade routes were established through cities that had been emptied of life. Laws of tolerance toward religion were proclaimed even as temples were burned to ash. The empire's genius was its ability to reconcile opposites, to slaughter without malice, to civilize through annihilation, to rule by the illusion of peace built upon terror. This was not barbarism, but ideology. The Khan's justice was cosmic, absolute, and unanswerable. The victims who died in boiling oil or beneath the hooves of horses were not merely punished. They were absorbed into a grand design that demanded submission as its only virtue. To resist such a force was to rebel against fate itself. And fate in the Mongol imagination was always merciless. But even within this structured savagery, there existed layers of spectacle designed to remind both subjects and enemies that cruelty was not just punishment, it was philosophy. The executions were often public, staged like theater. Crowds would gather as soldiers recited the condemned's crimes, not to provoke pity, but to provoke awe. When a noble was trampled to death, it was done beneath the Khan's throne, symbolizing that even the highest blood was dirt before the empire. When rebels were impaled, the poles were left standing for months, the corpses rotting beneath the sun until they merged with the landscape. The horizon itself became part of the empire's propaganda, a skyline of warning. Such spectacles were meant to teach not only obedience, but gratitude. For to live under the Khan's rule was to be reminded daily of the privilege of survival. It is said that when the Khan's armies reached Samarkand, the city's scholars begged for mercy, offering gold and tribute. The Khan accepted their surrender, but then ordered that every 10th man be executed to ensure that fear remained stronger than hope. The message was simple. Even obedience could not erase the memory of rebellion. The people were to understand that peace under the Mongols was not a gift. It was a contract written in the blood of those who had tested its boundaries. Through such acts, Genghis Khan constructed not merely an empire of land, but an empire of imagination. A dominion of thought where terror became faith, and submission became the only form of freedom left. What made this darkness so enduring was that it worked. The Mongol Empire, for all its horrors, achieved a level of unity and stability unmatched for centuries. Trade flourished across Asia. Scholars, merchants, and monks traveled safely under the banner of a man who had once burned entire nations to dust. This was the paradox of Genghis Khan's world. The same hands that destroyed cities also built the foundations of global communication and law. His cruelty was not an accident of temperament. It was a method of governance that fused the brutality of war with the logic of empire. He understood perhaps more clearly than any ruler before or after him that the memory of terror endures longer than loyalty, that fear carves deeper into the human soul than love ever could. And so the legend of his punishments outlived even the empire itself. In distant lands, parents frightened their children with his name. Kings studied his tactics to imitate them. Priests invoked him as proof of divine wrath. The silver death, the burning cauldrons, the tearing horses. These were not just acts of vengeance, they were symbols of a truth. Civilization has never truly abandoned. That power and cruelty are two sides of the same coin. And that order often demands a price too high for mercy to pay. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, his empire stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian. His armies undefeated, his legacy sealed in both glory and horror. But the steppe winds that swept across his grave carried whispers that the world would never again be free from the lessons he had taught. Once perfected becomes a system, and that the memory of pain is the most unbreakable empire of all. Even now, centuries later, his name resonates not merely as a conqueror, but as a concept, a symbol of what happens when human will transcends morality, when discipline merges with destruction, and when civilization learns to justify its own savagery. The methods of Genghis Khan were not relics of a bygone age. They were blueprints for power, echoes of which still reverberate in every institution that governs through fear. In the end, the Khan's most terrifying creation was not his empire of land and blood, but his empire of memory, built on the idea that cruelty, when sanctified by law and belief, can outlast empires, nations, and time itself. When the steppe winds finally ceased to carry the echoes of Mongol horns, when the horses were gone and the banners lay buried beneath centuries of dust, the silence that remained was heavier than any victory. The empire that had once stretched from the edges of China to the gates of Europe became a ghost. Its cities reclaimed by grass, its fortresses reduced to mounds of earth, its chronicles scattered across languages and centuries. Yet what endured was not the marble, nor the monuments, nor the myths of conquest. What endured was fear, an invisible architecture that still shapes how power imagines itself. For the Mongols had proven that domination was not achieved through sheer strength, but through the mastery of human psychology, through the ability to turn pain into permanence and terror into law. Every empire that rose after them, from the Ottomans to the British, learned this truth in their own ways, that the spectacle of cruelty could create obedience more efficiently than armies, and that civilization itself could be built upon the ruins of compassion. In the quiet plains of Mongolia today, where wild horses roam and the horizon seems infinite again, it is almost impossible to imagine that this same earth once drank the blood of millions. The winds that sweep across the steppes move through the bones of the forgotten, through the dust of burned cities and the ashes of entire peoples erased by decree. Archaeologists uncover fragments, arrowheads, coins, shattered ceramics. But the true relics of the Mongol age are not made of metal or stone. They exist in the collective memory of mankind, in the way we still equate authority with violence and obedience with survival. The systems we have built, governments, armies, economies, still echo the same logic that Genghis Khan perfected. Control through fear, order through punishment, progress through subjugation. History's tragedy is that its lessons rarely fade. They mutate. The cruelty that once scorched villages now hides behind institutions and technologies. Its face changed, but its intent eternal. And yet beyond the horror, there is also a strange and unsettling admiration that clings to his name. Genghis Khan is remembered not only as a destroyer, but as a creator, a man who imposed unity upon chaos, who built trade routes that would become the arteries of civilization, who turned nomads into an empire. His cruelty was methodical, his mercy conditional, his justice absolute. He believed he was chosen by heaven, and perhaps in some dark cosmic sense, he was the embodiment of nature's indifference, of fate's unrelenting hunger to balance power and suffering. To look upon his legacy is to confront the truth that progress and brutality often walk the same road. That the human desire to rule has always been shadowed by the human capacity to destroy. So, as the story of Genghis Khan's tortures fades into the mists of time, what remains is not the image of boiling cauldrons or galloping horses, but a question that lingers like smoke after battle. How much of the world we call civilized was built on the same foundations of terror? When we glorify empires for their achievements, do we also inherit their silence? The unspoken acceptance that cruelty, when systematized, becomes invisible. Perhaps that is the final legacy of the Khan, that every age, no matter how enlightened, carries within it the same potential.